My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today, it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. Most of these poems began, as you can see, out of a recovery of childhood memories. And I didn't really write anything until I had started to teach, and until I think that drove me to it, in fact. But the origins and the germinating image was usually something that just appeared out of the past 20 years ago.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the David Geffen stage at Kaufman Hall here at the 92nd Street Y. And tonight promises to be a very special evening, a celebration of the poetry of Seamus Heaney. That voice, of course, you heard to open the evening was his, that inimitable voice. Reading here on this very stage in March 1971, he graced our stage at least 12 times during his life by our count. And we're so pleased to welcome his words, if not his voice, back in our hall tonight. And to welcome all of you here today and all of you, many of you joining us online as well. His is a poetical voice that will never cease to echo, one of the seminal writers of the last 50 years, a poet for the ages, who wrote, as this extraordinary new volume shows, so wonderfully about his own time and indeed about our time. Everyone, I think, has a Heaney moment when they first encountered his voice, and it is one that we all return to again and again. I hope all of you tonight will have that experience of finding a poem that you knew or that you are introduced to for the very first time. We're gathered tonight to celebrate this monumental publication, the Poems of Seamus Heaney, published this week, reviewed wonderfully today in the New York Times. It is a magnificently edited and put together volume, the final testament of his published poetic work. All of the finished poems from 1959 to his death in 2013 are there, including some being published for the very first time. And all credit goes to the editors of the volume, the Heaney family, who we're very happy to welcome some of them here tonight, and of course to his publishers in the UK and to his estimable publisher here in the United States, Farrar, Straus and Giroux. This volume is an exhilarating journey, and the best way to celebrate that journey is by, of course, taking you all along on it. So tonight we've gathered an extraordinary group of readers, some of whom knew or were taught by him, others who are just fans, to read a chronological selection of the poems, just a smattering, but if we attempted, of course, to go through all of the poems here tonight, we'd still be reading come Thanksgiving. Such is the depth of his poetic achievement. Our readers tonight will include Brian Cox, one of the great actors of our time, indelibly for his role as Logan Roy in Succession. He's an Emmy, Olivier, and Golden Globe award-winning actor, has appeared in many acclaimed movies and on the London stage in Titus Andronicus, Rat in the Skull, and Make It Happen, which premiered at the Edinburgh Festival earlier this year. In 2003, he was made a CBE, Commander of the British Empire. Robert Pinsky, who reviewed the new collection today in the Times, is joining us. His latest book of poems is a Proverbs of Limbo. He's written numerous other books of poetry. His best-selling translation of the Inferno, he was the United States Poet Laureate from 1997 to 2000, and he also founded something very dear to many of our hearts, the Favorite Poem Project, which brought together thousands of American readers to read poems that they admired from many different iconic poets. Kevin Young will read. He's the author of 16 books of poetry and prose, including his most recent Night Watch, just came out earlier this fall. And he is the poetry editor of The New Yorker, where he hosts the Poetry Podcast. And he's the editor of 11 volumes, including A Century of Poetry in The New Yorker, 1925 to 2025, which we celebrated here in February. Peter Sachs will be reading. He's an artist and a writer. He's the author of 6 volumes of poetry and critical prose and teaches at Harvard University. Mary Jo Salter will be reading. She's a distinguished poet, editor, essayist, and playwright, has co-edited several editions of the Norton Anthology of Poetry, and served for years as a professor at Johns Hopkins University writing seminars. And then finally, Paul Muldoon, who taught at Princeton for 35 years, was the previous poetry editor of The New Yorker, and he's the author of 15 collections, including Moist Sand and Gravel, which won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize. Just a note to say that unfortunately Jory Graham, who was supposed to join us, couldn't at the last minute, and she sends her sincere regards and regrets. Finally, since I have you all here, I just want to highlight a few upcoming events that we have at the Poetry Center. Next Monday, the 24th, we welcome Paul Muldoon back to our stage for a performance with his band Rogue Oliphant, with appearances by the great folk rocker Richard Thompson, the poet Marie Howe, and journalist Molly Jong-Fast. I hope you all join us to see what that combination conjures up on stage. December 5th, we're going to be doing a very special evening here on the art of the picture book with best-selling children's book author Mac Barnett, and he'll be appearing with the actress Jennifer Garner to talk about picture books that they love, and they'll be doing an evening reading of Goodnight Moon and many other picture books to what I imagine will be a mainly adult audience, so I hope you'll join us for that too. And then finally, just to highlight one more thing, on December 10th, we have an evening exploring desire in fiction, desire later in life, with Cynthia Zarin, Judith Thurman, and Meg Wolitzer. Wanted to also highlight books are for sale, including this incredible new collection. Postman's will be selling books as you exit, so please, and also books by all of our poets reading tonight will also be for sale there. So please join us and buy a book. Without further ado, let's start the evening. So let's please welcome our first reader to the stage, Kevin Young.
Good evening. My name's Kevin Young, and I had the good fortune to be one of Seamus Heaney's students. Tonight, I think we are all his students, and certainly we are in his debt. He also lived in my college dorm, so I got to hear him read many times at many occasions, from teas to pub nights. So it was quite wonderful to see this then future Nobel laureate read in the cafeteria, for instance. It's a real honor to read from his colossal and complete and completely incredible poems. I want to thank the editors for doing such a tremendous job, and to his family for sharing him with us. This is digging. Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Hello, I'm Mary Jo Salter. I only got to meet Seamus Heaney 3 times, but I feel as if I knew him much better because I used to drive with, whenever he had a new book that he recorded, I would drive around in my car and listen to him over and over and over again. As you've already heard from the recording of his voice and the poem that Kevin just read, he wrote a tremendous amount about family and so well about family. So I thought I would read this early one from 1966. It's called Midterm Break. I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells knelling classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbors drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box, as in a cot. No gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year.
It's always a privilege to read the work of a master, and Seamus was a master. Bogland. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up, an astounding crate full of air. Butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered, salty and white. The ground itself is kind, black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They'll never dig coal here. Only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp, Our pioneers keep striking, inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet center is bottomless.
Two months passed away. We are brought on to a day in February on which was held the yearly statute or hiring fair in the county town of Casterbridge. At one end of the street stood from 200 to 300 blithe and hearty labourers waiting upon chance. Among these, carters and wagoners were distinguished by having a piece of whipcord twisted round their hats. Thatchers wore a fragment of woven straw. Shepherds held their sheep crooks in their hands, and thus the situation required was known to the hirers at a glance. As many of you will recall, that's the opening of chapter 6 of Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and it's a description of a hiring fair. And this first poem of Seamus Heaney I'm going to read is his great description of a servant boy. It's a poem that has a particular resonance for me, as so many of his poems do. I was brought up in pretty much the same zone, had much the same experience. And in fact, my father was a hired boy. He was a servant boy. He was hired out at the age of 11 to a farmer who happened to be called Hardy. But in any case, this is Seamus. Fair Hill here. Fair Hill is not just a beautiful hill, it's the hill on which the hiring fair is held as it flies past your ear. And this is a poem that is wonderfully tentative in its method. It just comes round the corners of the lines with beautiful assurance in its appearing to lack assurance. Servant boy, he is wintering out the back end of a bad year, swinging a hurricane lamp through some outhouse, a jobber among shadows. Old work whore, slave blood, who stepped fair hills under each bidder's eye, and kept your patience and your counsel. How you draw me into your trail broken from haggard to stable, a straggle of fodder stiffened on snow, comes first footing the back doors of the little barons, resentful and impenitent, carrying the warm eggs.
I'm going to read you two poems from the volume called North. Characteristically of that book, these poems think about how insane violence, extreme civic rage leave their remnants in peat, in bogs, in archaeology, and in human memory. First of these two poems from North, The Grobal Man. As if he had been poured in tar, he lies on a pillow of turf and seems to weep the black river of himself. The grain of his wrists is like bog oak, the ball of his heel like a basalt egg. His instep has shrunk cold as a swan's foot or a wet swamp root. His hips are the ridge and purse of a mussel. His spine an eel arrested under a glisten of mud. The head lifts. The chin is a visor raised above the vent of his slashed throat that has tanned and toughened. The cured wound opens inwards to a dark elderberry place. Who will say corpse to his viscid cast? Who will say body to his opaque repose? And his rusted hair a mat unlikely as a fetus's. I first saw his twisted face in a photograph, a head and shoulder out of the peat, bruised like a forceps baby. But now he lies perfected in my memory, down to the red horn of his nails, hung in the scales with beauty and atrocity, with the dying gall too strictly compassed on his shield, with the actual weight of each hooded victim, slashed and dumped. The second poem of another kind of preservation in history of the Vikings, who were among the many invaders of the islands of Ireland and Britain and so forth. North. I returned to a long strand, the hammered curve of a bay, and found only the secular powers of the Atlantic thundering. I faced the unmagical invitations of Iceland, the pathetic colonies of Greenland, and suddenly those fabulous raiders, those lying in Orkney and Dublin, measured against their long swords rusting. Those in the solid belly of stone ships, those hacked and glinting in the gravel of thawed streams were ocean-deafened voices warning me, lifted again in violence and epiphany. The longship's swimming tongue was buoyant with hindsight. It said Thor's hammer swung to geography and trade, thick-witted couplings and revenges, the hatreds and behindbacks of the L-thing, lies and women, exhaustions, nominated peace, memory incubating the spilled blood. It said, lie down in the word hoard, burrow the coil and gleam of your furrowed brain. Compose in darkness. Expect aurora borealis in the long foray, but no cascade of light. Keep your eye clear as the bleb of the icicle. Trust the feel of what nubbed treasure your hands have known.
I love that line, lie down in the word hoard. He would sometimes speak about one's own word hoard and how you could find one. And it's daunting, but necessary. This poem is called Casualty. Casualty. He would drink by himself and raise a weathered thumb toward the high shelf, calling another rum and back current, without having to raise his voice. or order a quick stout by a lifting of the eyes and a discreet dumb show of pulling off the top. At closing time would go in waders and peaked cap into the showery dark, a dull-kept breadwinner, but unnatural for work. I loved his whole manner, sure-footed, but too sly. His deadpan, sidling tact, his fisherman's quick eye and turned, observant back. Incomprehensible to him, my other life. Sometimes on the high stool, too busy with his knife at a tobacco plug and not meeting my eye in the pause after a slug, he mentioned poetry. We would be on our own and always politic and shy of condescension. I would manage by some trick to switch the talk to eels, or lore of the horse and cart, or the provisionals. But my tentative art, his turned back watches too. He was blown to bits out drinking in a curfew others obeyed. 3 nights after they shot dead the 13 men in Derry. Paris 13, the walls said. Bogside nil. That Wednesday, everyone held his breath and trembled. 2. It was a day of cold, raw silence, wind-blown, surplice, and soutane. Rained on, flower-laden, coffin after coffin seemed to float from the door of the packed cathedral like blossoms on slow water. The common funeral unrolled its swaddling band, lapping, tightening till we were braced and bound like brothers in a ring. But he would not be held at home by his own crowd, whatever threats were phoned, whatever black flags waved. I see him as he turned in that bombed, offending place, remorse fused with terror in his still, knowable face, his cornered, out-faced stare blinding in the flash. He had gone miles away, for he drank like a fish, nightly, naturally, swimming towards the lure of warm, lit-up places, the blurred mesh and murmur, drifting among glasses in the gregarious smoke. How culpable was he that last night when he broke our tribe's complicity? Now, you're supposed to be an educated man, I hear him say. Puzzle me the right answer to that one. 3. I missed his funeral. Those quiet walkers and sideways talkers shoaling out of his lane to the respectable purring of the hearse. They move in equal pace with a habitual, slow consolation of a dawdling engine, the line lifted hand over fist, cold sunshine on the water, the land banked under fog. That morning, I was taken in his boat, the screw purling, turning indolent fathoms white. I tasted freedom with him, to get out early, haul steadily off the bottom, dispraise the catch, and smile as you find a rhythm working you slow mile by mile into your proper haunt, somewhere well out, beyond. Dawn sniffing revenant, plodder through midnight rain. Question me again.
I'm going to read a poem from the same period, from 1979, and I think it's probably to me anyway, it's the most sensuous poem that Seamus Heaney ever wrote. And it does that partly because you literally are tasting the words. It's called Oysters. Our shells clacked on the plates. My tongue was a filling estuary. My palate hung with starlight. As I tasted the salty Pleiades, Orion dipped his foot in the water. Alive and violated, they lay on their bed of ice. Bivalves, the split bulb and philandering sigh of ocean, millions of them ripped and shucked and scattered. We had driven to that coast through flowers and limestone, and there we were, toasting friendship, laying down a perfect memory in the cool of thatch and crockery. Over the Alps, packed deep in hay and snow, the Romans hauled their oysters south of Rome. I saw damp panniers disgorge the frond-lipped, brine-stung glut of privilege, and was angry that my trust could not repose in the clear light, like poetry or freedom leaning in from sea. I ate the day deliberately, that its tang might quicken me all into verb, pure verb.
Seamus loved music. He loved friendship as well. And he enjoyed both of those things with a man named David Hammond. This poem I'm going to read to you, The Singer's House, is in some ways worlds removed from those two poems of ancient persistent violence that I read to you from North. But in fact, it's deeply related. David Hammond and Seamus had plans of music and performance and friendship together that they found themselves in a pretty dark mood, forced to delay or forestall or give up because of terrible violence. That is behind the pleasure and warmth of this poem, which is about a house where David Hammond was. The Singer's House. When they said Carrickfergus, I could hear the rusty echo, the frosty echo of salt miners' picks. I imagined it, chambered and glinting, a township built of light. What do we say anymore to conjure the salt of the earth? So much comes and is gone that should be crystal and kept amid amicable weathers that bring up the grain of things, their tang of season and store, and all the packaging we'll get. So I say to myself, Guibarra, and its music hits off the place like water hitting off granite. I see the glittering sound framed in your window, knives and forks set on oilcloth, and the seals' heads suddenly outlined, scanning everything. People here used to believe that drowned souls lived in the seals. At springtides, they might change shape. They loved music and swam in for a singer who might stand at the end of summer in the mouth of a whitewashed turf shed, his soldier to the jam, his song a rowboat far out in evening. When I came here first, you were always singing, a hint of the clip of the pick in our winnowing climb and attack. Raise it again, man. We still believe what we hear.
Changes. As you came with me in silence to the pump in the long grass, I heard much that you could not hear. The bite of the spade that sank it, the slithering and grumble as the mason mixed his mortar, and women coming with white buckets like flashes on their ruffled wings. The cast iron rims of the lid clinked as I uncovered it. Something stirred in its mouth. I had a bird's eye view of a bird, finch green, speckly white, nesting on dry leaves, flattened, still, suffering the light. So I roofed the citadel as gently as I could and told you, and you gently unroofed it. But where was the bird now? There was a single egg, pebbly white, in the rusted bend of the spout, tail feathers splayed and sat tight. So tender, I said, remember this. It will be good for you to retrace this path when you have grown away and stand at last at the very center of the empty city.
Evening. Hello, Seamus. I'm sure if we all said it loud enough, he'd hear us. I'm glad that Mary Jo read Oysters. It reminds me of the first time I met Seamus, actually. We'd invited him to come down and read at Johns Hopkins. This is in the 1980s, which is around the time that these poems are moving into. And it's the first time I met him, so I wanted to impress him at least with Baltimore, if not with myself. So I took him down to the covered market and figured he'd just written oysters. Let's give him some Chesapeake oysters. So they laid 24 oysters on the counter in front of us. And we each took the first one, tasted it, looked at each other, and I thought, how polite is this guy going to be? After all, he's a guest, he's touring, and so on. He squints the way he might sometimes and looked up and said to me, I don't know how we'd developed this amount of trust so quickly, it's a bit like eating your grandmother. So I thought, okay, I'm in the presence of somebody not afraid to be almost taboo-like transgressive in his metaphors or similes. But the friendship started there, I think. And 45 years later, I'm still very moved by everything he said, wrote, and was. I'm sorry Jory isn't here. She loved him equally, independently at first, and then together. We spent time with them in Ireland as well. So greetings to the family, and greetings to you all. Jory wanted to read from clearances. I'll just read two of this extraordinary sonnet sequence of elegies that Seamus wrote after the death of his mother, who died in 1984, and these poems came out in 1987. This is number 3. When all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one, like solder weeping off the soldering iron. Cold comforts set between us, things to share, gleaming in a bucket of clean water. And again, let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So, while the parish priest at her bedside went hammer and tongs at the prayers for the dying, and some were responding and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent dipping knives, never closer the whole rest of our lives. Well, there it is. And then the eighth and last of the sequence, which recalls the cutting down of a chestnut tree. And as was typical of Seamus, this is not the Yeatsian symbolic great-rooted blossomer of among school children, but the actual tree that was planted when Seamus was born. And so recalling its demise becomes the source of this extraordinary evocation of where the soul might reside. I thought of walking round and round a space utterly empty, utterly a source, where the decked chestnut tree had lost its place in our front hedge above the wallflowers. The white chips jumped and skited high. I heard the hatchet's differentiated, accurate cut, the crack, the sigh and collapse of what luxuriated through the shocked tips and wreckage of it all. Deep planted and long gone, my coeval chestnut from a jam jar in a hole, its heft and hush become a bright nowhere, a soul ramifying and forever silent, beyond silence listened for. And this is one of the two poems that I had chosen to read. Those were Jory's. And it's from a later collection, but has its closeness to the poems I was reading now. It's from Lightnings, and it's number 8. And it conjures Clonmacnoise, the great abbey from the 6th century that Seamus loved and would visit. And it reads as follows. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind, so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails. And then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life here and will drown, the abbot said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvelous as he had known it.
So this is another sonnet, a Petrarchan sonnet, in which, like so many great poets, Seamus Heaney manages to get away with maneuvers that are really verboten. One is not allowed, and day one in poetry school, I'm sure many of you have been there, the first thing you're told is do not, under any circumstances, rhyme the likes of string and parceling. Just don't do that. And as for sling and expecting, don't do that either. So this, I mean, one of the great gifts that he had was his ability to manage the rhythms of everyday speech in the tradition of William Wordsworth, I suppose, in particular, and to find in the detail of day-to-day life, in this case in Northern Ireland, images that help all of us understand ourselves. And there was a lot to understand in Northern Ireland, and there still is. And for example, the phenomenon that's mentioned here of the bee men, the so-called bee specials, and they were not to be confused with the A specials. The B specials was a secondary division of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. They were founded in 1920, and we've had discussions in this part of the world about defunding the police. These guys were actually defunded and stood down in 1970, so that even by Northern Irish standards, they tended to misbehave. So anyway, this is about the nod and a wink, or at least the nod, the understanding between neighbours. These auxiliary policemen who were predominantly Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist, who met their Catholic neighbours, stopped their cars and asked them who they were, knowing perfectly well who they were. So that's what lies behind this, the nod. Saturday evenings, we would stand in line in Ludden's butcher shop. Red beef, white string, brown paper ripped straight off for parceling along the counter edge. Rib roast and shin plonked down, wrapped up, and bow-tied, neat and clean, but seeping blood. Like dead weight in a sling, heavier far than I had been expecting, while my father shelled out for it, coin by coin. Saturday evenings, too, the local beemen, unbuttoned but on duty, thronged the town. Neighbours with guns, parading up and down, some nodding at my father, almost past him, as if deliberately they'd aimed and missed him, or couldn't seem to place him, not just then.
So my family is all from Louisiana in the deep country, where I like to say they have to truck in daylight. So it was such a pleasure and to realize that though half a world away, Seamus had grown up knowing the country too, and my family were still farmers, and he had that experience too. So it was so wonderful to study with him, and what he taught us, I think, was not just how to write poems, but really how to be a poet in the world, which was something I didn't know. I realize now a lot of the poems that I are reading to you tonight, and that we all are reading, are really poems about poetry in some way, about the making and the legacy one faces. This poem that I'm going to read, Mint, is, I think, wonderful in that way because it praises the everyday, but also praises something that is usually not praiseworthy. Mint. It looked like a clump of small, dusty nettles growing wild at the gable of the house beyond where we dumped our refuse and old bottles. unverdant ever, almost beneath notice. But, to be fair, it also spelled promise and newness in the backyard of our life, as if something callow yet tenacious sauntered in green alleys and grew rife. The snip of scissor blades, the light of Sunday mornings when the mint was cut and loved. My last things will be first things slipping from me. Yet let all things go free that have survived. Let the smell of mint go heady and defenseless like inmates liberated in that yard. Like the disregarded ones we turned against because we'd failed them by our disregard.
There's a poem called Keeping Going. Just a couple of notes on it. As they fly by your ear, you might not be familiar with the concept of a diamond. A diamond in this case is, in Northern Irish parlance, a diamond as big as a square. It's a town square that takes the shape of a diamond. As though there aren't enough problems. Anyway, so there's the diamond. What else is there? There's the sporran. Now, many of you will be familiar with the sporran. It's the Gaelic word for a purse, and it's what the piper, in this case, the piper wearing a kilt, or many people wearing a kilt. I mean, let's face it, you can't go out in a kilt without a sporran. You've got your purse hanging out there in front. So the piper coming from far away, apparently to those who have studied these poems, and indeed it's great to have this new edition of them. One note that I noticed here is that this may be a reference to Hugh MacDiarmid, the great Scottish poet, who made a famous visit to Belfast at one point. And Hugh MacDiarmid, it may be a reference to him. It's certainly a poem that's dedicated to Hugh, or for Hugh. But the Hugh who is most immediately referred to is Seamus Heaney's brother, Hugh, who is the person in this poem who is keeping going. Keeping going in the sense of managing against all the odds in the context of the violence of Northern Ireland. It's a poem in several sections. It's in 6 sections. Remember Seamus Heaney saying that the last thing you want to do at a poetry reading is to say, I'm going to read my new poem. It's in 6 sections. Keeping going. The piper coming from far away is you with a whitewash brush for a sporran wobbling round you. A kitchen chair upside down on your shoulder, your right arm pretending to tuck the bag beneath your elbow, your pop eyes and big cheeks nearly bursting with laughter, but keeping the drone going on interminably between catches of breath. 2, the whitewash brush, an old blanched skirted thing on the back of the bar door, biding its time until spring airs spelled lime in a work bucket and a pot stick to mix it in with water. Those smells brought tears to the eyes. We inhaled a kind of greeny burning and thought of brimstone. but the slop of the actual job of brushing walls, the watery grey being lashed on in broad swatches, then drying out whiter and whiter, all that worked like magic. Where had we come from that was this kingdom we knew we'd been restored to? Our shadows moved on the wall, and a tar border glittered the full length of the house, a black divide like a freshly opened, pungent, reeking trench. 3. Piss at the gable, the dead will congregate, but separately. The women after dark, hunkering there a moment before bedtime. The only time the soul was let alone, the only time that face and body calmed in the eye of heaven. Buttermilk and urine, the pantry, the housed beasts, the listening bedroom. We were all together there in a foretime, in a knowledge that might not translate beyond those wind-heaved midnights we still cannot be sure happened or not. It smelled of hill-fort clay and cattle dung. When the thorn tree was cut down, you broke your arm. I shared the dread when a strange bird perched for days on the byre roof. 4. That scene with Macbeth, helpless and desperate in his nightmare, when he meets the hags again and sees the apparitions in the pot, I felt at home with that one, all right. Hearth, steam and ululation, the smoky hair curtaining a cheek. Don't go near bad boys in that college you're bound for. Do you hear me? Do you hear me speaking to you? Don't forget. And then the pot stick, quickening the gruel. The steam crown swirled, everything intimate and fear-swathed, brightening for a moment, then going dull and fatal and away. 5. Grey matter like gruel flecked with blood in spatters on the whitewash. A clean spot where his head had been. Other stains subsumed in the parched wall he leant his back against that morning like any other morning. Part-time reservist, toting his lunchbox. A car came slow down Castle Street, made the halt, crossed the diamond, slowed again and stopped level with him, although it was not his lift. And then he saw an ordinary face for what it was, and a gun in his own face. His right leg was hooked back, his sole and heel against the wall, his right knee propped up steady, so he never moved, just pushed with all his might against himself. Then fell past the tarred strip, feeding the gutter with his copious blood. 6. My dear brother, you have good stamina. You stay on where it happens. Your big tractor pulls up at the diamond. You wave at people. You shout and laugh above the revs. You keep old roads open by driving on the new ones. You called the pipers sporrans whitewash brushes and then dressed up and marched us through the kitchen. But you cannot make the dead walk or right wrong. I see you at the end of your tether sometimes, in the milking parlor, holding yourself up between two cows until your turn goes past, then coming to in the smell of dung again and wondering, is this all? As it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be? Then rubbing your eyes and seeing our old brush up on the byre door and keeping going.
This must be Kevin's. I'll give it to him. It's all about retrieval, right? Wanting to salute this incredible anthology of works, and the review that Rohit Pinsky wrote is, I think, just a masterpiece and reminds us how important it is to pay attention to the uncollected poems, such as the poem that he beautifully describes called Lint Water. But it's marvelous to be amongst these poems. And this one is called Postscript. It's a late poem, just about taking a drive. And I guess it fits into the great tradition of what are called loco-descriptive poems, poems that are written while you're moving. And in this case, a short pause. But I wanted to just read what Seamus had to say about the writing of this poem. In the great collection of interviews that he did with O'Driscoll, I think it's called Stepping Stones. And O'Driscoll says, this was written pretty quickly, wasn't it? And he says, yes, it was written quickly, and I believe I sent it off almost immediately to the Irish Times. It could have been given a long Wordsworthian title, something like Memorial of a Tour by Motorcar with Friends in the West of Ireland. But that would misrepresent the sudden, speedy feel of it. It's a trip that he took with Mari and Brian Friel and his wife. And then he went on in this interview and said, now and again, a poem comes like that, like a ball kicked in from nowhere. In this case, I was completely absorbed in writing one of the last of the Oxford lectures when I had this quick sidelong glimpse of something flying past. Before I knew where I was, I went after it. It came from remembering, this is this lovely thing he says here, but I seem to have lost it on my screen. It came from remembering the site when we had stopped to look at Mount Vernon, Lady Gregory's summer house, still there facing the waters and the wild, when we drove on into this glorious exaltation of air and sea and swans. There are some poems that feel like guarantees of your work to yourself. They leave you with a sensation of having been visited. And this was one of them. Postscript. And sometime, make the time to drive out west into County Clare, along the flaggy shore, in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, the surface of a slate-gray lake is lit by the earthed lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there. A hurry through which known and strange things pass. As big, soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open.
We're moving on, sadly, to 2013, the year of Seamus Heaney's death. But he wrote a beautifully uplifting poem in the last month of his life, and it's called, and it's for a very young person, and it's called In Time. Energy, balance, outbreak. Listening to Bach, I saw you years from now, more years than I'll be allowed. Your toddler wobbles gone, a sure and grown woman. Your bare foot on the floor keeps me in step. The power I first felt come up through our cement floor long ago palps your soul and heel and earths you here for real. An oratorio would be just the thing for you. Energy, balance, outbreak, at play for their own sake, but for now we foot it lightly in time and silently.
And this is our last poem. Those winter evenings. Those winter evenings we walked the Strand, watching lights of planes coming in above Howth Head, sailing down the dark, beginning their descent high in the east, each on the same flight path at staggered intervals. It was like that dream of a kite flyer, the string taut in his hand and the lift palpable, but the kite itself invisible to him, a heavy weight. Drag upwards through the mist roof, yet in the breast a kind of settlement, as on those winter evenings when we walked and watched for lights of planes.